They called it junk. An elderly couple bought an abandoned ferry for pocket change, but what they found sealed beneath the cargo deck was a secret worth $240 million that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Let's get started. The morning fog rolled in thick off the Atlantic, curling through the empty streets of Harborview, Maine like smoke from a fire long since burned out. It was the kind of fog that swallowed sounds whole, muffled footsteps, silent seagulls, turned the whole world into something grey and waiting. Harold McAllister stood at the kitchen window of their small Cape Cod house, watching the mist drift past the glass, a cup of coffee cooling in his weathered hands. He was 72 years old. His knuckles were swollen from decades of gripping welding torches. His back ached in ways the doctors couldn't fix anymore. But his eyes, pale blue like the ocean on a calm day, still held something sharp, something that refused to quit. Behind him, Dorothy hummed softly as she moved around the kitchen, the familiar melody of some song from their wedding day drifting through the small space. She was 70 years old, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose and a gentleness that made everyone who met her feel instantly at ease. 48 years they'd been married. 48 years of morning coffee and evening walks, of arguments that never lasted and silences that said more than words ever could. "You're brooding again," Dorothy said without looking up. She was spreading butter on toast, the knife scraping in that rhythm Harold had memorized decades ago. "I'm not brooding," he replied. "I'm thinking." "Same thing with you." She walked over and handed him a plate. 2 slices of toast, strawberry jam on the side, just the way he liked it. "What's on your mind?" Harold turned from the window and looked at his wife. Really looked at her. The lines around her eyes, the way her hands trembled just slightly now when she poured tea, the quiet strength that had carried them both through harder times than most people could imagine. He loved her more at 70 than he had at 22 when he first saw her shelving books in the Harborview Public Library, her hair dark as midnight, her laugh like music. "Just thinking about how things used to be," he said finally, "when the shipyard was running, when this town had a heartbeat." Dorothy sat down across from him at the small kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of use. "It still has a heartbeat," she said gently, "just a quieter one." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Harborview had been dying for 20 years now, slow and steady, like a ship taking on water with no one left to bail it out. The fishing industry had collapsed in the early 2000s when the regulations tightened and the big commercial operations moved elsewhere. The shipyard where Harold had worked for 37 years closed in 2008. The cannery shut down the following spring. One by one, the young people packed up their trucks and drove south toward Portland or Boston, chasing jobs that didn't exist here anymore. Now Harborview was a ghost of itself. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open ones. The movie theater had been boarded up since 2015. The elementary school, where Dorothy had worked as a librarian for 29 years, had merged with the next town over because there weren't enough children left to fill the classrooms. The population had dropped from nearly 4,000 in its peak to just under 1,100. And most of those who remained were old, like Harold and Dorothy, too rooted to leave, too stubborn to give up. "I saw Gus yesterday at the hardware store," Harold said between bites of toast. "He said the town council's finally doing something about the ferry." Dorothy's eyebrows rose. "The Northern Star?" Harold nodded. "They're auctioning it off. Apparently the liability insurance is costing the town more than they can afford. They want someone to take it away." The Northern Star. Even the name carried weight in Harborview. It had been sitting at the old municipal dock for over 30 years now, rusting, rotting, becoming more of a monument to decay with each passing season. Nobody remembered exactly when it stopped running. Some said 1987. Others swore it was earlier. What everyone agreed on was that it had been a passenger ferry once, running routes between Harbourview and the outer islands before some kind of incident shut it down. An accident, some said. A scandal, others whispered. The details had faded into the fog of local legend, but the ferry itself remained, massive and silent, its hull stained with rust, its windows dark and empty. Locals called it cursed, said strange lights flickered in the portholes at night, said the captain had vanished without a trace, said anyone foolish enough to board it would carry its bad luck with them for life. It was the kind of story people told to scare teenagers and entertain tourists, though tourists rarely came to Harbourview anymore. Dorothy set down her coffee cup. Why would anyone want that old thing? It must be falling apart. Harold shrugged. Gus said starting bid is $1. They just want it gone. $1? Dorothy laughed softly. For an entire ferry? Whoever buys it has to haul it away or restore it. That's the catch. Probably cost more to move it than it's worth. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fog still pressing against the windows. Then Dorothy did something she rarely did. She reached across the table and took Harold's hand. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "when we first got married, and you promised me we'd live on a boat someday?" Harold's chest tightened. Of course he remembered. It was the summer of 1976. They were barely into their 20s, broke as could be, crammed into a one-bedroom apartment above the old bakery on Main Street. Dorothy had grown up landlocked in Vermont, had never even seen the ocean until she moved to Harbourview for her first library job. But from the moment she stood on the shore and watched the waves roll in, something in her had changed. She fell in love with the water, the way some people fall in love with music or mountains. It became part of her soul. And Harold, young and foolish and desperately in love, had made a promise he couldn't keep. "Someday," he'd said, holding her on the beach as the sun set behind the lighthouse. "Someday I'll buy us a boat and we'll live on the water, just you and me and the sea." 48 years later, that promise remained unfulfilled. There had always been something else. Bills to pay, kids to raise, a mortgage that stretched on forever. Their 2 children, both grown now with families of their own, had moved away years ago. The savings account that was supposed to fund their retirement adventures had been drained by medical bills when Dorothy had her hip surgery 3 years back. Now they lived on Social Security and Harold's small pension, counting every dollar, watching their dreams shrink to fit their reality. "I remember," Harold said, his voice rough. Dorothy squeezed his hand. "I never held it against you, you know, not once." "I know." But he held it against himself, every single day. That evening after dinner, Harold sat alone in the small room they called his office, though really it was just a corner of the basement with a desk and a lamp. He was looking at the auction notice Gus had given him. The paper was crinkled, printed on the town's ancient copier that always left streaks across the page. Municipal auction. Vessel, Northern Star. Former passenger ferry. Condition, as is. Starting bid, $1. Buyer responsible for all removal, restoration, or demolition costs. Auction date, Saturday, October 12th at 10 a.m. Municipal Dock. Harold read it 3 times. Then he walked upstairs to the bedroom where Dorothy was reading, her glasses sliding down her nose, a thick novel open in her lap. "Dottie," he said. She looked up. He only called her Dottie when something serious was on his mind. "I want to bid on that ferry." She set the book down slowly. "Harold, I know it sounds crazy. I know it's probably a pile of rust, but—" He struggled to find the words. "You've given me 48 years. 48 years of patience and love, and never once complaining that I didn't give you what I promised. I'm 72 years old. I don't have forever left. But maybe just maybe, I can finally give you something close to that dream." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. The old house creaked around them, settling into the night the way it had for decades. Then she smiled, that same smile that had captured his heart in a dusty library all those years ago. "You foolish, wonderful man," she said softly. "How much are you thinking of bidding?" Harold hesitated. "Everything in the adventure fund. The adventure fund." It was a mason jar they kept on top of the refrigerator, stuffed with loose bills and spare change they'd been saving for years. It was supposed to be for a trip they kept talking about but never took. Alaska, or maybe the Grand Canyon, somewhere neither of them had ever been. "How much is in there now?" Dorothy asked. $850, give or take. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that made her whole face light up. $850 for a ferry that's been rotting for 30 years. "It's probably worth less than the scrap metal," Harold admitted, "but the structure might still be sound. I spent my whole life working on ships. If anyone can figure out what's salvageable, it's me." Dorothy studied him for a long moment. Harold felt himself holding his breath, waiting for her to talk him out of it, to remind him of all the reasons this was foolish, impractical, impossible. Instead, she said, "When's the auction?" "Saturday morning." She nodded slowly, then reached over and patted the bed beside her. "Come sit with me. We'll figure out the details together." And just like that, without fanfare or argument, they decided to buy a ferry. Saturday arrived cold and grey, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Harold and Dorothy walked down to the municipal dock together, arm in arm, their breath visible in the October chill. They wore matching wool coats they'd bought at the thrift store in Portland 5 years back. Harold carried an envelope with $850 in cash. Dorothy carried a notebook and pen because she always carried a notebook and pen. The dock was emptier than Harold expected. A few town officials stood near a folding table with paperwork spread across it. The harbour master, a gruff man named Walter, who Harold had known for decades, was drinking coffee from a thermos and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. There were maybe 5 or 6 other people milling about, but none of them looked like serious bidders. Just curious locals who'd come to watch. And there she was, the Northern Star. Harold had seen the ferry countless times over the years, but standing this close, he was struck by just how massive it was. The vessel stretched nearly 200 feet long, its hull painted in what had once been white, but had faded to a sickly grey streaked with rust. 3 decks rose above the waterline, their windows dark and grimy. The name Northern Star was barely visible on the bow, the letters corroded almost beyond recognition. Ropes hung loose from the railings, seabirds had nested in the upper structures, the whole thing listed slightly to starboard, as if tired of standing upright. It was, by any reasonable measure, a wreck. But Harold didn't see a wreck. He saw steel bones that had survived 30 years of harsh winters. He saw a hull that was still floating, still intact. He saw potential buried beneath the decay, and more than anything, he saw possibility. Dorothy squeezed his arm. "She's seen better days." "Haven't we all?" Harold replied. The auction itself was brief and anticlimactic. Walter called the proceedings to order at exactly 10 a.m., his voice bored and mechanical as he read the terms. "As is condition. Buyer assumes all responsibility. No warranties expressed or implied. Removal required within 90 days or ownership reverts to the town." "Do I have an opening bid?" Walter asked. Silence. The other onlookers shuffled their feet and looked away. Harold raised his hand. $850. Walter blinked. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Someone laughed, quickly stifled. $850 to the gentleman in the wool coat, Walter said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Do I have $875? Nothing." "Going once, going twice." Walter shook his head slowly. "Sold. to Harold McAllister for $850. God help you. Just like that, they owned a ferry. The paperwork took longer than the auction itself. Harold signed form after form while Dorothy read every line, her librarian's instinct refusing to let anything pass without scrutiny. Walter handed over a ring of old keys, their metal tarnished and cold. "These are for the main doors and the captain's quarters," Walter explained. "Don't know if they still work, don't know what's inside. Last time anyone officially boarded that thing was probably 1992 or 93. County inspector came out, condemned it as unsafe for occupancy, and that was that." "No one's been on board since?" Dorothy asked. Walter shrugged. "Teenagers sometimes, dares and such. Never for long. They always come back spooked." He gave Harold a look that mixed pity with something else, maybe respect. "You're really planning to restore this thing?" "Planning to try," Harold said. "You're braver than me." Walter clapped him on the shoulder. "Good luck, Harold. You're going to need it." As they walked away from the table, Harold heard the whispers behind them. He didn't need to turn around to know what people were saying. Those old fools, buying a pile of rust, probably spent their life savings, must be losing their minds. Let them talk, he thought. Let them laugh. He'd spent his whole career listening to people say something couldn't be done, that a weld wouldn't hold, that a ship was too far gone, that the damage was beyond repair. And time after time, he'd proved them wrong with patience, skill, and stubborn determination. This would be no different. They didn't board the ferry that first day. The tide was wrong, and Dorothy insisted they go home, make a proper plan, gather supplies. Harold agreed, though every part of him wanted to climb aboard immediately, to start exploring, to see what secrets the old vessel held. That night, lying in bed, neither of them could sleep. "Are we crazy?" Dorothy whispered in the darkness. "Probably," Harold admitted. "Good. I was worried it was just me." They laughed together, soft and warm, the way they had for nearly 5 decades. And for the first time in years, Harold felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The next morning, they returned to the ferry at low tide. Harold carried a toolbox, flashlight, and notebook. Dorothy brought her camera, an old digital thing they'd bought in 2005 that still worked perfectly fine. They wore boots and heavy jackets, prepared for whatever they might find. The gangway was rotted through in places, so Harold tested each board before stepping. Dorothy followed close behind, her hand gripping the rusted railing. "Careful," Harold said over his shoulder. "I'm 70 years old," Dorothy replied. "Careful is my middle name now." The main deck was exactly what Harold expected. Debris everywhere, old newspapers, beer cans, evidence of animals making homes in forgotten corners. The wood beneath their feet groaned but held. Dorothy photographed everything while Harold made notes, documenting damage, assessing what could be salvaged. They worked their way inside, through the main passenger cabin. Seats that had once been plush were now rotted and torn, stuffing spilling out like snow. Windows were cracked or missing entirely. Birds had built nests in the overhead luggage compartments. The smell was musty, salt and decay, age and abandonment. But the bones were good. Harold could see it. The structural steel was sound. The deck plates weren't rusted through. The interior could be gutted and rebuilt. It would take work, years of work. But it was possible. They climbed to the second deck, then the third. Each level revealed new damage, new challenges, but also new potential. Dorothy found an old captain's log in the wheelhouse, its pages water-stained and faded, but still partially legible. The last entry was dated March 15th, 1987. 1987, Dorothy breathed. That's almost 40 years ago. "That's when it stopped running," Harold said. "Whatever happened, it happened then." They descended into the lower levels, where the air grew colder and the darkness thicker. Harold's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating narrow corridors and sealed doors. Some opened easily, others were rusted shut. They found storage rooms filled with old equipment, engine parts, life jackets cracked and worthless. They found crew quarters with personal effects still scattered about, photographs, letters, a shaving kit, a romance novel with a bookmark still holding someone's place. It was eerie, like stepping into a time capsule, like the ship had been frozen in a single moment, waiting for someone to return and set things right. "Harold," Dorothy said softly, "look at this." She was standing near a wall in what appeared to be a crew lounge. On the wall hung a collection of photographs, the ferry in its glory days, gleaming white, passengers waving from the decks, crew members in uniform smiling, a captain with a thick beard and kind eyes standing proudly at the helm. "She was beautiful once," Dorothy whispered. Harold nodded. "She can be again." They continued exploring, mapping the ship in their minds, making lists of what needed to be done first, second, third. The electrical system was dead, unsurprisingly. The plumbing was a disaster. The engines hadn't run in decades and would need complete rebuilding if they could be saved at all. But none of that dampened their spirits. They were on an adventure, their adventure. After 48 years of waiting, they were finally doing something extraordinary. It was Dorothy who found the cargo hold. They had worked their way to the very bottom of the ferry, to the vehicle bay where cars and trucks would have been loaded in the ferry's operational days. The space was vast and empty, the floor stained with decades of oil and grime. Dorothy wandered along the perimeter while Harold examined the massive bay doors, calculating what it would take to get them functional again. "Harold!" Dorothy called, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "Come look at this." He crossed to where she stood, near the rear bulkhead. She was pointing at a door, not just any door, but a massive steel door that looked completely out of place. It was reinforced, industrial grade, the kind you might find in a bank vault or a military installation. Multiple locks were visible on its surface, heavy-duty mechanisms that looked far more serious than anything a passenger ferry would need. And most striking of all, the seams around the door had been welded shut. "What in the world?" Harold muttered. He ran his hand along the welds. They were old, oxidized, but professionally done. Someone had sealed this door shut and meant for it to stay that way. "This is the cargo hold," Dorothy said, studying a faded placard on the wall nearby. "But why would anyone weld a cargo hold shut?" Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever's in there, someone went to a lot of trouble to keep it hidden." They stared at the sealed door in silence. The ferry creaked around them, settling into the tide, and for a moment Harold felt something he couldn't quite name, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, a sense that they had stumbled onto something far bigger than an abandoned ship. "We'll need a cutting torch to get through those welds," Harold finally said. "Probably a plasma cutter for the locks." "Should we report this?" Dorothy asked. "To the authorities?" Harold considered. "Report what? That we found a locked door? They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they'll take the ferry back before we even have a chance to see what's inside." Dorothy nodded slowly. "So we open it ourselves. When we're ready, when we have the right equipment." He looked at his wife, seeing the same curiosity burning in her eyes that he felt in his chest. "For now, we keep exploring. We learn everything we can about this ship, and then we open that door." They spent 2 more hours aboard the Northern Star, documenting, photographing, planning. By the time they climbed back down to the dock, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Harold stood on the weathered planks, looking back at the ferry. In the fading light, she looked almost noble, her rust-streaked hull catching the sunset's glow. The Northern Star. She had carried passengers across these waters for years, had been loved and then abandoned, had sat forgotten while the world moved on without her. But not anymore. Dorothy slipped her hand into his. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade. "We really bought a ferry," Dorothy said softly. "We really did. People are going to think we've lost our minds." Harold smiled. Let them. He thought about the sealed cargo hold, about the welded door and the heavy locks. Whatever was behind it had been hidden for almost 4 decades. Protected. Concealed. Someone had gone to enormous lengths to ensure it stayed that way. Why? The question burned in his mind, demanding an answer. But answers would come in time. For now, they had taken the first step. They had bought the Northern Star for $850, every penny of their adventure fund, the dream they'd saved for years. And somehow, standing here in the gathering dusk, Harold knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder. "It feels different, doesn't it? Like we're supposed to be here." Harold nodded. "It does." The fog was rolling in again, curling around the ferry's hull, softening her edges. The seabirds had gone quiet. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the dock. "Whatever's in that cargo hold," Dorothy said quietly, "whatever someone went to such lengths to hide, we're going to find it, aren't we?" Harold looked at his wife, at the determination in her eyes, at the woman who had spent 48 years believing in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. "Yes," he said, "we are." And as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon and the stars began to emerge overhead, Harold McAllister made himself a silent promise. Whatever secrets the Northern Star held, whatever dark history had been sealed behind that welded door, he would uncover the truth. For Dorothy. For Harborview. For everyone who had ever been told their dreams were too big, too late, too impossible. The Northern Star had been waiting 30 years for someone to find her secrets, and Harold was finally ready to listen. 3 days passed before Harold could get his hands on the equipment he needed. 3 days of restless nights and distracted mornings, of Dorothy catching him staring out the window toward the harbor, his coffee growing cold in his hands. The sealed cargo hold consumed his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that welded door, those industrial locks, that unmistakable message, "Stay out." But Harold McAllister had never been good at taking orders. On the 4th morning, he drove his old pickup truck to the edge of town where Gus Henriksen lived in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by rusted machinery and forgotten projects. Gus was 75, a former shipyard foreman who had worked alongside Harold for nearly 3 decades. They had welded hulls together in freezing rain, shared thermoses of coffee during midnight shifts, and buried more colleagues than either cared to count. If anyone in Harborview understood what Harold was attempting, it was Gus. Harold found him in the barn, hunched over an ancient outboard motor, grease up to his elbows. "Heard you bought the Northern Star," Gus said without looking up. "Whole town's talking about it." "Whole town's always talking," Harold replied. "Doesn't mean they're saying anything worth hearing." Gus chuckled and set down his wrench. He straightened slowly, his back cracking audibly. "So what brings you out here? Social call, or do you need something?" "Need to borrow your plasma cutter, and maybe the portable generator if you've still got it working." Gus raised an eyebrow. "What for?" Harold hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about the sealed cargo hold, not even Gus. Something about it felt too strange, too significant to share casually. But he needed the equipment, and Gus wasn't the type to lend tools without asking questions. "Found something on the ferry," Harold said carefully. "A door that's been welded shut, industrial grade. Someone went to a lot of trouble to seal it up." Gus went very still. The playful light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something harder. "The cargo hold?" Harold blinked. "You know about it?" Gus was quiet for a long moment. He walked to his workbench and poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented thermos, handing one to Harold. Then he leaned against the bench and stared at the floor. "There are stories," Gus said finally. "Old stories. From back when the ferry was still running." "What kind of stories?" The kind people don't talk about in daylight. Gus took a long sip of coffee. The Northern Star stopped running in March of '87. Everyone knows that. What most folks don't know is why. Harold waited, his own coffee untouched. The official story was mechanical failure. Engines gave out, too expensive to repair. Ferry got decommissioned, nice and simple. Gus shook his head slowly. But some of us who worked the docks back then, we heard other things. Rumors about the captain, a man named Raymond Cole, said he was into something bad. Smuggling, maybe. Running cargo that wasn't on any manifest. What kind of cargo? Nobody knew for sure, but there was an investigation. Federal types came through, asking questions, flashing badges. It lasted a few weeks, then just stopped, vanished, like it never happened. Gus looked up at Harold, his expression grave. And Captain Cole, he disappeared the same week the ferry stopped running. Just gone. No body, no note, nothing. His wife waited 2 years before she had him declared dead. Harold felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the barn. You think something happened to him? I think a lot of things happened that nobody wanted to explain. Gus set down his coffee cup. And I think that cargo hold has been sealed shut for a reason. That's exactly why I need to open it. Gus studied him for a long moment. You sure about this, Harold? Some doors, once you open them, you can't close again. Harold thought about Dorothy, about the dream he'd promised her 48 years ago, about the ferry sitting at the dock, waiting to reveal its secrets, about the fact that he was 72 years old and running out of time to do something that mattered. I'm sure, he said. Gus sighed heavily. Then he pushed himself off the workbench and walked toward the back of the barn. Plasma cutters over here, generators in the shed. You'll need to haul them yourself. My back's shot. Thank you, Gus. Don't thank me yet. Gus paused, his hand on a dusty tarp. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Whatever you find in there, whatever's been hidden all these years. Gus turned to look at Harold, his weathered face lined with something that might have been fear. Be careful who you tell. There are people in this town with long memories, and some of them would do anything to keep the past buried. Harold loaded the equipment into his truck without another word. But Gus's warning echoed in his mind the entire drive home. Dorothy was waiting for him when he pulled into the driveway. She had packed a bag with supplies, flashlights, water bottles, her camera, a first aid kit. She was wearing her oldest jeans and a flannel shirt that had once belonged to Harold, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Ready? She asked. Harold looked at his wife of 48 years, at the determination in her eyes, at the quiet strength that had carried them both through harder times than he could count. Let's go find out what they've been hiding. The walk down to the municipal dock felt different this time. The fog had lifted, but the sky was overcast, grey and heavy, pressing down on the world like a weight. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and urgent. The ferry loomed at the end of the dock, larger and more imposing with each step. They boarded carefully, Harold carrying the generator while Dorothy managed the plasma cutter and supplies. The gangway groaned beneath their weight, but held firm. Once on the main deck, they moved with purpose toward the stairs leading down to the vehicle bay. The lower levels of the ferry felt different today, colder, darker, more alive with shadows and secrets. Dorothy kept close to Harold, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I keep thinking about what you told me, she said softly, about Captain Cole, about the investigation that just stopped. Trying not to think about it too much, Harold admitted. But you are thinking about it? Yeah. He glanced back at her. I am. They reached the vehicle bay and crossed to the rear bulkhead where the sealed door waited. Harold set down the generator and studied the welds in the beam of his flashlight. They were even more formidable up close than he remembered. Whoever had done this work knew what they were doing. These weren't amateur welds. They were professional, precise, meant to last. "This is going to take a while," Harold said. Dorothy nodded. "I'll hold the light." Harold primed the generator and fired it up. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the metal walls. He pulled on his welding mask, picked up the plasma cutter, and began to work. The first weld took nearly 40 minutes to cut through. The metal was thick, stubbornly resistant, and Harold had to stop twice to let the cutter cool down. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. His shoulders ached, his hands trembled from the vibration, but slowly, inch by inch, the welds gave way. Dorothy stood beside him, patient and steady, adjusting the flashlight whenever he needed a better angle. She didn't complain about the noise or the heat or the sparks that occasionally flew toward her boots. She just waited, watching, believing in him the way she always had. After 2.5 hours, the last weld fell away. Harold set down the cutter and pushed up his mask. His arms felt like lead, his back screamed in protest, but the door was free. "The locks," Dorothy said, pointing. There were 3 of them, massive padlocks, industrial grade, their casings oxidized but still intact. Harold examined them one by one. They weren't standard locks. They had military markings. "I can cut through these," he said, "but it's going to take another hour at least." Dorothy squeezed his shoulder. "I'll get you some water. We're not leaving until we see what's inside." By the time Harold finished with the last lock, nearly 4 hours had passed since they'd started. His entire body ached. His vision was slightly blurred from staring at the plasma arc for so long. But when the final lock clattered to the floor and the door stood free before them, none of that mattered. He looked at Dorothy. She looked back at him. "Together," she said. Harold gripped the door handle. It was cold beneath his fingers, stiff with age. He pulled. The door didn't budge. He pulled harder, throwing his weight into it. Dorothy grabbed the handle beside him, and together they heaved. With a groan that sounded almost human, the door swung open. The first thing that hit them was the air, or rather, the absence of it. A rush of stale, dry atmosphere poured out of the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of something ancient and preserved. Harold realized with a start that the hold had been vacuum sealed. Whoever had locked this door hadn't just wanted to keep people out. They had wanted to keep whatever was inside perfectly preserved. "Flashlights," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stepped through the doorway together, their beams cutting into the darkness, and stopped. The cargo hold stretched before them, far larger than either had expected. It must have occupied nearly a quarter of the ferry's lower deck, but it wasn't empty. Far from it. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling. Military-style containers sat in neat rows down the center. Sealed metal drums clustered in the corners. Everything was organized with meticulous precision, labeled with numbers and codes that meant nothing to Harold. "My God," Dorothy breathed. "How much is in here?" Harold walked slowly between the rows, his flashlight sweeping across the labels. Some were in English, others were in German. A few were in languages he didn't recognize at all. "There must be hundreds of containers," he said. They stopped at the first crate within reach. It was wooden, reinforced with metal bands, marked with a faded stamp that read "Fragile" in 3 languages. Harold found a pry bar among the tools they'd brought and wedged it beneath the lid. "Ready?" he asked. Dorothy nodded, her camera raised. Harold pushed down on the pry bar. The wood creaked, resisted, then gave way with a crack that echoed through the hold. The lid came free, and they looked inside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, neither of them breathed. The crate was lined with velvet, faded but still soft, and nestled in that velvet, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam, were bars of gold. 10 of them, stacked in 2 neat rows. Each bar was stamped with an eagle clutching a swastika. Nazi gold. Harold reached out with a trembling hand and touched one of the bars. It was cold, impossibly heavy for its size. Real. Undeniably, impossibly real. "Harold," Dorothy whispered. "Harold, is that—" "Gold," he finished. "It's gold." They stared at the crate for what felt like hours. Then, moving as if in a dream, they began opening others. The second crate contained paintings, rolled canvases in protective tubes, each one labeled with a name and date. Dorothy carefully extracted one and unrolled it just enough to see the subject. A portrait of a woman in a blue dress, the brushwork unmistakably masterful. "This looks like a Vermeer," she breathed. "Harold, this could be a Vermeer." The third crate held jewelry, rings, necklaces, brooches, all of them antique, many engraved with names or initials. Dorothy picked up a delicate gold locket and opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young couple, faded with age, their faces frozen in a moment of happiness that had been stolen along with the jewelry itself. "These belong to people," Dorothy said, her voice cracking. "Real people. What happens next will put their lives in danger, expose secrets that powerful families buried for decades, and prove that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest courage. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." They continued opening crates, container after container, each one revealing new horrors and wonders. Religious artifacts, chalices and crosses and candlesticks, clearly looted from churches and synagogues. Rare coins in leather pouches, sculptures wrapped in cloth. Antique books with gilt lettering and hand-painted illustrations. And more gold, so much gold. Harold lost count of how many bars they found. Dozens at least. Maybe over 100. Each one stamped with that same hateful insignia, that same mark of evil. "This is World War II, Dorothy said, sinking down onto one of the crates. "This is looted treasure. Stolen from families, from museums, from entire countries. Some of this was thought lost forever." "But how did it end up here?" Harold asked. "On a ferry in Maine?" Dorothy shook her head slowly. "There were smuggling networks after the war, people who moved stolen goods through secret channels. Some of it was recovered, but most was never found." She looked around at the mountains of treasure surrounding them. This must have been part of that. Hidden away, moved from place to place, until it ended up here. "In 1987, Harold said. "That's when the ferry stopped running. That's when Captain Cole disappeared. He must have been transporting it, or guarding it, or he found out what was really in here and paid the price." They sat in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. Dorothy pulled out her camera and began photographing everything, her hands steady despite the trembling in her voice. Harold walked the perimeter of the hold, counting containers, trying to wrap his mind around the sheer scale of what they'd found. In the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of metal drums, he found a leather satchel. It was old, cracked with age, but still intact. He carried it back to where Dorothy sat and opened it carefully. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Manifests, shipping routes, inventory lists, and names, page after page of names. "Harold," Dorothy said, looking over his shoulder, "these are shipping records, dates going back to 1973. 73. But the ferry didn't stop running until 87. That means they were using this ferry for 14 years. Dorothy flipped through the pages, her librarian's instincts taking over. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was an operation, a smuggling operation that lasted over a decade. Harold studied the names on the documents. Some meant nothing to him. Others— "Dorothy, look at this." He pointed to a signature at the bottom of one manifest. The handwriting was elegant, practiced. The name was impossible to mistake. "Edmund Ashford," Dorothy read aloud. Harold felt his stomach drop. "The Ashfords, the founding family of Harborview. One of the wealthiest families in Maine," Dorothy added. They've been on the town council for generations. The current one, Victor, he just donated money for the new library wing last year. They kept reading. More names emerged. The former mayor who had served from 1975 to 1989, a state senator's aide, a customs official, a federal judge. This goes all the way up, Harold said. This wasn't just local. This was organized, Dorothy finished. Systematic, protected. At the very bottom of the satchel, Dorothy found one last document. It was newer than the others, dated March 12, 1987. 3 days before the ferry stopped running. 3 days before Captain Cole disappeared. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to no one. If you're reading this, then I'm already gone. I tried to stop them, but there are too many, too powerful. They'll kill me before they let this come to light. What's in this hold? It belongs to the people it was stolen from. Families destroyed by war. Lives erased. I couldn't save myself, but maybe I can save this truth. Find the manifest. Follow the names. Make them pay for what they've done. God forgive me for my part in it. Raymond Cole. Dorothy's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. He knew what was happening, and he tried to stop it. And they killed him for it. Harold looked around the hold, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just smuggling. This was murder, conspiracy, decades of lies. They spent another hour documenting everything. Dorothy photographed every crate, every document, every bar of gold. Harold made notes, tried to estimate quantities, attempted to calculate values. By the time they were done, his notebook was full and his mind was reeling. "How much do you think it's all worth?" Dorothy asked. Harold shook his head slowly. "The gold alone has to be worth tens of millions. But the art, the artifacts, the historical value of what's here," he paused, trying to find words adequate to the moment. 200 million, maybe more, maybe a lot more. Dorothy sat down heavily on one of the crates. Her face was pale in the flashlight beam. $240 million, she said softly. "We bought this ferry for $850, and underneath it was a fortune." Harold sat beside her, taking her hand. "What do we do?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. She looked around at the treasure surrounding them, at the stolen heritage of countless families, at the price of decades of lies and violence. Then she spoke, her voice steady and certain. "This doesn't belong to us, Harold. It never did. It belongs to the people it was stolen from, families who lost everything, communities that were destroyed." She squeezed his hand. "We have to make this right." Harold nodded slowly. He had known, from the moment he saw the first gold bar, what they would have to do. But hearing Dorothy say it, hearing her choose righteousness over riches, made him love her more than he ever had before. "We'll need proof," he said. "Documentation. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we go to anyone. And we need to be careful about who we tell." Dorothy picked up the letter from Captain Cole. "He tried to expose this, and they killed him. The people whose names are in these documents, some of them are still alive, still powerful, still dangerous. Then we do this smart. We gather evidence, we find people we can trust, and we make sure that when the truth comes out, it can't be buried again." They sealed up the crates they had opened and took only the photographs and the leather satchel with its damning documents. The treasure would stay where it was, hidden and safe, until they figured out their next move. As they climbed back up through the ferry, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. Shadows stretched long across the deck. The wind had picked up, carrying the salt smell of the incoming tide. Harold locked the cargo hold door behind them as best he could, wedging a steel beam across it. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but it might slow them down. They walked across the gangway and onto the dock, both of them silent, both of them processing the magnitude of what they'd found. Dorothy clutched the satchel to her chest like a sacred text. Harold carried the weight of Captain Cole's last words in his heart. "Wait," Dorothy said suddenly, stopping mid-step. "What is it?" She pointed toward the parking area at the end of the dock. "That car. Was that there when we arrived?" Harold squinted through the gathering dusk. A black sedan sat in the far corner of the lot, its windows tinted, its engine silent. He didn't recognize it. In a town as small as Harborview, he knew every vehicle by sight. "No," he said slowly, "it wasn't." They stood frozen, watching the car. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the driver's side window rolled down an inch. Someone was inside. Someone was watching. Harold grabbed Dorothy's arm. "We need to go, now." They walked as quickly as they could without running, trying not to look panicked, trying not to look like people who had just discovered a secret worth killing for. Harold's truck was parked at the other end of the lot. It felt miles away. Behind them, he heard a car door open, then close. Footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate. "Don't look back," Harold whispered. "Just keep walking." They reached the truck. Harold fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking. The footsteps behind them stopped. He could feel eyes on his back, boring into him like drills. The key found the lock. The door opened. They climbed in. Harold started the engine and pulled out of the lot without looking in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to see who was standing there. He didn't want to know. They drove in silence for 5 minutes before Dorothy spoke. "They know," she said quietly. "Someone knows we opened that hold." Harold gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Gus warned me. He said there are people with long memories, people who would do anything to keep the past buried. Then we've just become the only thing standing between them and their secret." They pulled into their driveway as the last light faded from the sky. The house looked the same as always, small and worn and welcoming. But nothing felt safe anymore. Nothing felt certain. Inside, Dorothy spread the documents across the kitchen table while Harold locked every door and checked every window. The leather satchel sat open, its contents damning and undeniable. Names of powerful people, records of unspeakable crimes, evidence of a conspiracy that had survived for almost 4 decades. "We can't stay here," Dorothy said. "We can't run either. If we disappear, the evidence disappears with us." "Then what do we do?" Harold sat down across from her, looking at the woman he'd loved for 48 years. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was thinking, calculating, strategizing. The same brilliant mind that had organized thousands of library books was now organizing the most important fight of their lives. "We find allies," Harold said. "People outside Harborview, people the Ashfords can't reach. Journalists, federal investigators, someone with the power to actually do something. And until then, we protect what we know. We make copies of everything. We hide them in different places so that even if something happens to us, the truth survives." Dorothy reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was strong and certain. "Harold McAllister," she said softly. "We bought a ferry looking for adventure. I think we found something more." He smiled despite the fear coiling in his chest. "Scared? Terrified." She squeezed his hand. "But I wouldn't change a thing." Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The old house creaked and settled, and somewhere in the darkness, a black sedan sat at the end of their street, its engine silent, its driver watching. The secret that had been hidden for 37 years was finally coming to light, and the battle for the truth was only beginning. Harold didn't sleep that night. Neither did Dorothy. They sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, watching the street through the gap in the curtains. The black sedan left around midnight, its headlights sweeping briefly across their window before disappearing into the darkness. "They're not going to give up," Dorothy said quietly. "No," Harold agreed. "They're not." By morning, they had a plan. Dorothy would reach out to contacts she still had in the academic world, historians and archivists who specialized in World War II restitution cases. Harold would find someone to trust locally, someone who could help them protect the physical evidence aboard the ferry. But more than that, they had each other. 48 years of marriage had taught them how to face impossible odds together. They had survived layoffs and medical scares, loss and disappointment. They had raised children and buried parents and somehow emerged stronger each time. This would be no different. As the sun rose over Harborview, painting the harbor in shades of gold and rose, Harold stood at the kitchen window and watched the light touch the mast of the Northern Star. The ferry sat at the dock as it had for decades, rusted and forgotten and full of secrets. But not for much longer. Soon the world would know what had been hidden beneath its decks. Soon the families who had lost everything would finally have answers. Soon the powerful men who had protected this conspiracy for generations would face justice. Harold didn't know exactly how they would get there. He didn't know what dangers waited ahead, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They hadn't just bought an abandoned ferry for $850. They had bought the truth. And the truth, no matter how long it had been buried, always finds a way to rise. The first sign that something had changed came 2 days after they opened the cargo hold. Dorothy was in the kitchen making breakfast when the phone rang. She picked it up on the second ring, expecting a neighbor or maybe one of their children calling to check in. Hello? Silence. Not the silence of a deadline, but the silence of someone listening, breathing, waiting. Hello, Dorothy said again. Who is this? Nothing, just that presence on the other end, heavy and deliberate. She hung up. Her hands were trembling slightly as she set the phone back in its cradle. Harold looked up from his coffee. Wrong number? I don't think so. Dorothy wrapped her arms around herself. Someone was there. They just didn't speak. The calls continued. 3 times that day, twice the next. Always the same pattern. Silence, breathing. Then a click as the line went dead. Dorothy stopped answering by the 3rd day. The answering machine would pick up, record nothing but static, and she would delete the messages without listening. Then the mail started arriving opened. Harold noticed it first. Bills that had clearly been steamed apart and resealed, the envelopes wrinkled and slightly damp. Letters from their children with the flaps loose and crooked. A bank statement that looked like it had been photocopied before being stuffed back in its envelope. They're watching everything, Harold said grimly, examining a letter that had obviously been tampered with. Reading our mail, listening to our calls. They want us to know we're not safe. Intimidation tactics, Dorothy agreed. They're trying to scare us into silence. Is it working? Dorothy looked at him, her jaw set in that stubborn line he knew so well. What do you think? On the 5th day after their discovery, a black town car pulled into their driveway. It was sleek and expensive, completely out of place in their modest neighborhood of pickup trucks and sedans held together with rust and prayer. Harold watched from the window as a man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps 50 years old, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Harold's truck. His hair was silver at the temples, his face handsome in a cold, calculated way. He walked toward their front door with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. The doorbell rang. Harold and Dorothy exchanged a look. Then Harold opened the door. Mr. McAllister. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My name is Victor Ashford. I believe we have something to discuss. The name hit Harold like a punch to the gut. Ashford, the same name on those smuggling manifests, the same family that had helped hide Nazi treasure for decades. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Harold said carefully. Victor's smile didn't waver. May I come in? What I have to say is best discussed in private. Anything you have to say, you can say right here. For a moment, Something flickered behind Victor's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or the faint surprise of a man not used to resistance. Then the smile returned, smoother than before. Very well. I represent certain maritime salvage interests in the region. We've become aware that you recently purchased the vessel known as the Northern Star. It was a public auction, nothing illegal about it. Of course not. But the ferry and its contents have a complicated history. There are claims to certain items aboard that vessel that predate your ownership, items that rightfully belong to my family's estate. Dorothy stepped forward, her voice steady. What items would those be, Mr. Ashford? Victor turned his attention to her, his expression cooling slightly. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, Mrs. McAllister. Suffice it to say that my family has documentation proving ownership of cargo that was stored aboard that ferry decades ago. Cargo, Harold repeated. You mean the cargo that was sealed in the hold? The cargo that someone welded shut and hasn't touched in 37 years? Something shifted in Victor's face. Just for an instant his mask slipped, and Harold saw what lay beneath: calculation, danger, the cold assessment of a predator sizing up prey. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer, Victor said smoothly. $500,000, cash. In exchange, you sign over all rights to the ferry and its contents, and we all walk away satisfied. $500,000. It was more money than Harold and Dorothy had ever seen in their lives. More than their house was worth, more than their combined lifetime savings had ever amounted to. With that money, they could pay off every debt, travel anywhere they wanted, live comfortably for whatever years they had left. Harold looked at Dorothy. She looked back at him. And in that single glance, they made their decision. No, Harold said. Victor blinked. I'm sorry? I said no, we're not selling, we're not signing anything, and we're not walking away. The mask slipped further. Victor's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. Mr. McAllister, I don't think you understand the situation. There are forces at work here that are far beyond your comprehension. Powerful people who will not appreciate interference in their affairs. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. You're an old man living on a fixed income in a dying town. You have no resources, no connections, no power. What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish? Harold met his gaze without flinching. The right thing. Victor stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled again, but this time there was no pretense of warmth. It was the smile of a snake before it strikes. You're making a mistake, Mr. McAllister, a very serious mistake. I hope for both your sakes that you reconsider before it's too late. He turned and walked back to his car without another word. The engine purred to life, and the town car glided out of the driveway, disappearing down the street. Dorothy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was Victor Ashford. Grandson of Edmund Ashford, Harold confirmed. The same Edmund whose signature was on those manifests. He knows what's in that hold. He's known all along. And now he knows we know too. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in the living room with every light on, talking through their options, planning their next move. The offer of $500,000 hung in the air between them, a temptation neither would acknowledge. We need to go to the authorities, Dorothy said. The FBI, someone with the power to actually investigate this. And say what? That we found Nazi gold on an abandoned ferry? They'll think we're crazy. We have documentation, photographs, Captain Cole's letter. It's enough to start an investigation. Harold rubbed his eyes. Victor Ashford has been building his empire for decades. He has lawyers, politicians, connections we can't even imagine. The moment we go public, he'll bury us in litigation. Tie everything up in courts for years, make the evidence disappear. Then we need to be smart about it. We need allies, people we can trust. In this town, Harold laughed bitterly, Half the people here are connected to the Ashfords. The other half are too scared to cross them." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for her laptop, an old machine their daughter had given them 2 Christmases ago. She opened it and began typing. "What are you doing?" "Research. The thing I've spent my entire life doing." Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Victor Ashford, Ashford Development Corporation. Let's see what the world knows about our new friend." They spent the next 3 hours diving into the digital trail of the Ashford family. What they found was troubling. Ashford Development Corporation was one of the largest real estate companies in New England. They owned shopping centers, apartment complexes, commercial properties across 6 states. Their net worth was estimated at over $800 million. Victor Ashford was the CEO, the public face of the company, known for his philanthropy and his political connections. He had donated to the campaigns of senators, governors, even a presidential candidate. But beneath the polished surface, there were cracks. Dorothy found a series of articles from the 1990s about Edmund Ashford, Victor's grandfather. There had been investigations into smuggling operations along the Maine coast, suspicions of tax fraud and money laundering. Nothing had ever been proven. The investigations had been quietly closed, the files sealed. "It's the same pattern," Dorothy said. "Every time someone gets close to the truth, the investigation just stops." Because the Ashfords own the investigators, she kept digging. In an archive of old Harborview newspapers, she found a story from 1991 about Edmund Ashford's death. Heart attack, the official cause. But in the comments section of a local history forum, someone had written something that made her blood run cold. Edmund Ashford didn't die of natural causes. Ask about the ferry captain. Ask about what really happened in March of '87. The truth is still out there, buried with the bodies. The comment was from 2008. The user account had been deleted. "Bodies," Harold repeated. "They killed Captain Cole, maybe others too. And they'll kill us if we get too close." They looked at each other across the dim living room, 2 elderly people who had stumbled into something far bigger than themselves. The weight of it pressed down on them, suffocating in its enormity. "We can't give up," Dorothy said firmly. "Those treasures belong to the families they were stolen from. The truth about Captain Cole deserves to be told. We can't let fear stop us." "I'm not afraid for myself," Harold said quietly. "I'm afraid for you." Dorothy reached over and took his hand. 48 years, Harold. We've faced everything together. This won't be any different." The next morning, they drove to Portland. Dorothy had found a name, Rebecca Santos, an investigative journalist who had written extensively about corruption in coastal communities. Her work had helped expose fraudulent land deals, crooked politicians, and cover-ups that spanned decades. If anyone would take their story seriously, it was her. They met at a coffee shop near the Portland Press-Herald offices. Rebecca was younger than they expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes and a notebook that never left her hand. She listened without interrupting as they told their story, occasionally jotting notes, her expression carefully neutral. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You understand how this sounds," she said finally. "Nazi treasure hidden on a ferry in Maine. A multi-generational conspiracy. Murder, cover-ups, threats from one of the most powerful families in the state." "We understand how it sounds," Dorothy replied. "That's why we brought proof." She placed the leather satchel on the table. Rebecca opened it slowly, her eyes widening as she examined the documents inside. The manifests with Edmund Ashford's signature. The shipping routes dated back to 1973, Captain Cole's final letter. "My God," Rebecca breathed. "There's more," Harold said. "Photographs of everything in that cargo hold. Gold bars with Nazi insignia, paintings that match works on the looted art registry, jewelry, artifacts, religious items, all of it documented." Rebecca looked up at them, her expression shifting from skepticism to something like awe. "How much do you think it's worth?" "Our estimate is somewhere around $240 million, but the historical value, the significance to the families who lost these things, that's priceless." Rebecca closed the satchel carefully. "I need to verify this, independently, you understand?" "Of course." "And I need to see the cargo hold myself, photograph everything with my own equipment." Harold and Dorothy exchanged a look. "We can arrange that, but it has to be soon. Victor Ashford has already made threats. We don't know how much time we have." "Tomorrow," Rebecca said. "I'll drive up tomorrow." They shook hands and parted ways. As Harold and Dorothy walked back to their truck, a weight seemed to lift from their shoulders. They weren't alone anymore. Someone with a platform, with resources, with the skills to expose the truth was now on their side. But as they drove home, neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across from the coffee shop, or the man inside with a camera, photographing their every move. The call came at 3:17 in the morning. Harold was already awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, his mind too full for sleep. The phone on the nightstand rang once, twice. He grabbed it. "Mr. McAllister." The voice was electronically distorted, flat and inhuman. "Go to your window." Harold's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Go to your window, now." He moved without thinking, crossing to the bedroom window that overlooked the harbor. Dorothy sat up in bed, her eyes wide with alarm. "Harold, what's happening?" He pulled back the curtain and looked out into the night. The northern star was on fire. Flames licked up the sides of the ferry, orange and red against the black sky. Smoke billowed into the darkness, carried by the wind. Even from this distance, Harold could hear the roar of the blaze, could see the silhouettes of people gathering on the dock. "No!" he breathed. "No, no, no!" He was out the door before Dorothy could stop him, still in his pajamas, feet bare against the cold ground. He ran. 72 years old, bad back, aching knees, none of it mattered. He ran through the streets of Harborview, past dark houses and empty storefronts, toward the glow of the flames. By the time he reached the dock, the fire department was already there. 2 engines, a handful of volunteers, doing their best against a blaze that seemed determined to consume everything. The ferry was engulfed, flames dancing across the upper decks, paint bubbling and peeling in the heat. "Sir, you can't go out there!" someone shouted as Harold pushed past the barriers. He didn't listen. He ran onto the dock, feeling the heat intensify with every step. The gangway was burning, collapsing, but the main deck was still accessible from the dock's edge. He leapt. His feet hit metal, hot but not yet burning. Smoke filled his lungs. He could barely see, barely breathe, but he knew this ship now. He knew its layout, its passages, its secrets. He made his way below deck, half crawling, half stumbling through corridors thick with smoke. The fire was concentrated on the upper levels, probably started there deliberately. The cargo hold was at the bottom. If he could reach it, if he could seal it completely, maybe the vacuum seal would protect what was inside. He found the door he and Dorothy had cut open days before. The flames hadn't reached here yet, but he could feel them coming. He grabbed the steel beam they'd used to bar the door and shoved it back into place. Then he found a fire extinguisher, ancient and probably expired, and sprayed it around the seams for whatever good it might do. The smoke was unbearable now. His vision was going dark. He turned to retreat to find his way back to the deck, but his legs gave out. He fell to his knees, gasping for air that wasn't there. Strong hands grabbed him under the arms. Firefighters in masks, dragging him backward, shouting words he couldn't understand. He felt himself being lifted, carried, pulled out into the cold night air. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the Northern Star, still burning, still fighting, still holding her secrets. He woke in the hospital 3 hours later. Dorothy was beside him, her face streaked with tears, gripping his hand like she would never let go. "You're alive," she whispered. "You foolish, brave, wonderful man. You're alive." Harold's throat was raw from smoke. His lungs ached with every breath, but he managed to smile. "The cargo hold," he croaked. "Did it." The fire department got the blaze under control before it reached the lower decks. "The upper structure is badly damaged, but the cargo hold—" Dorothy's voice broke. "You saved it, Harold. Everything inside is intact." He closed his eyes, relief washing over him in waves. They hadn't won yet, not by a long shot, but they hadn't lost either. The sheriff arrived later that morning. His name was Marcus Patterson, a man in his late 50s with a thick moustache and eyes that never quite met yours directly. Harold had known him for decades, had always thought of him as decent enough, if somewhat ineffective. But watching Patterson now, seeing the way he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the way his gaze kept darting toward the door, Harold understood something he should have realized long ago. "We're treating this as accidental," Patterson said. "Old wiring, fuel leak, something like that. These old vessels, they're death traps." "It wasn't accidental," Harold said flatly. "Someone set that fire deliberately. I received a phone call telling me to look out the window. They wanted me to watch it burn." Patterson's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation, Harold." "It's the truth. Do you have any evidence? Any idea who might have done this?" Harold stared at him. "Victor Ashford came to my house 5 days ago, threatened me, told me I was making a mistake by not selling the ferry. Now it mysteriously catches fire in the middle of the night. You want to tell me that's a coincidence?" Patterson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Harold, you need to drop this. Whatever you think you found on that ferry, whatever you think you know, just let it go. Sign over the rights to Ashford, take his money, and walk away." "Or what?" Patterson met his eyes for the first time, and Harold saw fear there, genuine and deep. "Or the next fire won't just be the ferry." He left without another word. That afternoon, Dorothy helped Harold check out of the hospital against medical advice. His lungs were still raw, his body still weak, but he refused to stay. There was too much to do, too little time. Rebecca Santos arrived in Harborview the next morning as promised. She was shocked by what had happened, by the fire, by the threats, by the sheriff's obvious complicity, but she was also more determined than ever. "This is bigger than I thought," she said, reviewing the photographs on her camera after touring the damaged ferry. "The cargo hold is exactly as you described. Gold, paintings, artifacts, all of it. This is one of the largest discoveries of Nazi-looted art in American history." "And someone is willing to kill to keep it hidden," Dorothy added. "Then we make it impossible to hide." Rebecca's eyes were fierce. "I have contacts at the FBI, at the Justice Department, at international art recovery organizations. We're going to blow this wide open." But Victor Ashford moved faster than any of them anticipated. 3 days after the fire, Harold and Dorothy received a legal summons. Ashford Development Corporation was suing them for possession of the Northern Star and all its contents. The lawsuit claimed that cargo stored on the ferry in 1987 had been legally owned by the Ashford family estate, and that Harold and Dorothy's purchase of the vessel did not include rights to said cargo. The legal fees alone would bankrupt them. "He's trying to tie this up in court," Rebecca explained when she heard. "Delay everything until the evidence can be made to disappear. It's a classic tactic." "We can't afford lawyers," Harold said grimly. "We can barely afford groceries." But then something unexpected happened, something that reminded Harold why he had never given up on Harborview, even when the town seemed to give up on itself. The first visitor came the morning after the lawsuit was filed. It was Martha Wellington, owner of the hardware store, a woman Harold had known since childhood. She brought a casserole and an envelope. "It's not much," she said, pressing the envelope into Dorothy's hands. "But it's what I can spare. I heard about what you found. about what you're trying to do, and I want to help." Inside the envelope was $200 in cash. More visitors followed. The owner of the diner brought meals, enough to last a week. A group of fishermen volunteered to stand guard at the dock, watching the ferry in shifts. The retired postmaster, a woman named Agnes, who had served Harborview for 40 years, brought a box of old town records she had saved from being destroyed. "There's information in here about the Ashfords," she said quietly. "Things that might help, things they thought were buried." By the end of the week, the kitchen table was covered with donations: money, food, documents, offers of help from people Harold and Dorothy had known their entire lives. Neighbors who had whispered about them buying a pile of rust were now standing beside them, ready to fight. "I don't understand," Harold said one evening, overwhelmed by the outpouring. "A week ago, everyone thought we were fools." Gus Henriksen, who had come by to help repair the fire damage on the ferry, shook his head slowly. "A week ago, we didn't know what you were fighting for. We thought it was just an old boat, a crazy dream. But this—" he gestured toward the ferry, toward the dock, toward the town beyond. "This is about more than a boat. It's about the truth. It's about standing up to people who think they're above the law. It's about showing the world that Harborview isn't dead yet." He looked at Harold, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been pride. "You woke us up, Harold. You and Dorothy. You reminded us what it means to fight for something that matters." The following weeks were a blur of activity. Rebecca's story ran in the Portland Press-Herald, then was picked up by national outlets. Federal investigators arrived, tight-lipped and professional, taking photographs, collecting evidence, conducting interviews. Art historians came from universities across the country, carefully documenting the treasures in the cargo hold, matching pieces to databases of looted works. The Ashford lawsuit was challenged by a team of pro bono lawyers who had reached out after seeing the news coverage. They argued that cargo obtained through illegal means could not be claimed as legitimate estate property. The case would take months to resolve, but for the first time, Harold and Dorothy had legal representation that could match the Ashfords' resources, and the town of Harborview transformed around them. The empty storefronts on Main Street began to fill again, this time with journalists, researchers, curious tourists who had heard about the ferry and its secrets. The diner extended its hours. The bed and breakfast reopened for the first time in 5 years. There was talk of a documentary, of a book deal, of turning the Northern Star into a permanent museum. But the greatest change was in the people themselves. Harold saw it in the way they walked down the street, heads held higher. In the way they gathered at the dock each evening to check on the ferry, to share news, to simply be together. In the way children asked their parents about World War II and stolen treasure and what it meant to do the right thing. Harborview wasn't dying anymore. It was waking up. And at the center of it all were Harold and Dorothy McAllister, 2 elderly people who had bought an abandoned ferry for $850 and found something far more valuable than gold. One evening, as the sun set over the harbor and painted the water in shades of fire and gold, Harold stood on the deck of the Northern Star with Dorothy at his side. The upper structure was still scarred from the fire, but repairs were underway. Volunteers had been working for weeks, patching and painting, slowly restoring the ferry to something like her former glory. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd taken the money?" Dorothy asked softly. Harold considered the question. $500,000, a comfortable retirement, an easy way out. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about Captain Cole, about the families who lost everything to the Nazis, about all the people who kept this secret buried for almost 40 years. He shook his head. "Some things are worth more than money." Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder. 48 years, and you're still surprising me. 48 years, and you're still the best decision I ever made." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one above the harbor. The Northern Star creaked gently beneath them, settling into the tide, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. Somewhere in the cargo hold below, the treasures waited. Gold and paintings and artifacts, the stolen heritage of countless families. Soon they would be catalogued, authenticated, and returned to their rightful owners. Soon the world would know the truth about what had been hidden here. But for this moment, in the gathering darkness, Harold and Dorothy simply held each other and watched the night unfold. They had set out to buy an adventure. They had found a legacy, and the battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Harold believed they might actually win. The headline hit like a thunderclap on a cloudless day. Rebecca Santos had done exactly what she promised, and she had done it brilliantly. The Portland Press-Herald ran the story above the fold, the largest font they had used in years. Elderly couple uncovers $240 million Nazi treasure hidden for decades. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Harold and Dorothy standing on the deck of the Northern Star, the cargo hold visible behind them, crates of gold gleaming in the camera flash. Within hours, the story had spread beyond Maine. The Boston Globe picked it up first, then the New York Times, then the Washington Post. By evening, it was on every major news network. Cable channels interrupted their regular programming. Radio hosts debated the implications. Social media exploded with comments, shares, theories, and disbelief. Nazi gold in Maine trended worldwide. Harold and Dorothy watched the coverage from their small living room, the same room where they had sat in fear just weeks before, wondering if they would survive what they had uncovered. Now their faces were on every screen, their names on every tongue, their stories spreading across the globe like wildfire. "This is surreal," Dorothy murmured, watching a CNN anchor describe the discovery in breathless tones. "They're talking about us like we're heroes." "We're not heroes," Harold said quietly. "We just did what was right." But the world disagreed. Phone calls flooded in from newspapers, magazines, television shows, documentary filmmakers. Their answering machine filled up within the first hour and stayed full. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a passing greeting now knocked on their door with congratulations and casseroles. The postmaster had to make special trips just to deliver the letters that poured in from around the country and around the world. And then the federal investigators arrived. They came in black SUVs with government plates, serious men and women in dark suits who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They set up a command center in the old town hall, transforming the dusty meeting room into a hub of activity. Computers hummed, phones rang, agents hurried in and out with boxes of evidence and folders thick with documentation. The lead investigator was a woman named Special Agent Maria Delgado, no relation to Rebecca Santos, despite the similar surname. She was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She met with Harold and Dorothy on the second day, sitting across from them in the cramped town hall office, a recorder running between them. "Mr. and Mrs. McAllister," she began, her voice calm and professional. "I want you to understand the scope of what you've uncovered. This isn't just about stolen art or hidden gold. This is one of the largest discoveries of Nazi-looted assets in American history. The implications extend far beyond Harborview, far beyond Maine, far beyond this country." "We understand," Dorothy said, "or at least we're trying to." Agent Delgado nodded. "The documents you recovered from the cargo hold, the manifests, the shipping records, Captain Cole's letter, they've given us a roadmap to a criminal conspiracy that spans nearly 5 decades. We've already identified connections to smuggling networks that operated across Europe and South America, money laundering operations that funneled millions into legitimate businesses, and yes, murders committed to protect those secrets." Harold's jaw tightened. "Captain Cole." "Captain Raymond Cole," Agent Delgado confirmed. We've reopened the investigation into his disappearance. Based on the evidence you provided, we believe he was murdered in March of 1987, likely by individuals connected to the Ashford family. His body was never found, but we're pursuing new leads." "And Victor Ashford?" Dorothy asked. Agent Delgado's expression hardened. "Mr. Ashford is currently under investigation for multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and potentially accessory after the fact to murder. We executed a search warrant on his offices and personal residence yesterday. What we found has confirmed much of what your documents suggested." She paused, her eyes meeting theirs with something that might have been respect. "You should know that what you did, coming forward, refusing to be silenced, it took extraordinary courage. Lesser people would have taken the money and walked away. You chose differently, and because of that choice, justice will finally be served." The arrests began 3 days later. Victor Ashford was taken into custody at his Portland office, led out in handcuffs past a crowd of reporters and photographers who had gathered after an anonymous tip. His expression was cold, controlled, but Harold saw something flicker behind his eyes as the cameras flashed. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize your power has finally run out. Sheriff Marcus Patterson was next. He was arrested at his home early in the morning, still in his bathrobe, his wife weeping on the porch as federal agents escorted him to a waiting vehicle. He had been complicit in the cover-up for over 20 years, protecting the Ashfords in exchange for money and favors, looking the other way when evidence pointed to crimes he should have investigated. More arrests followed. A former state senator who had served from 1982 to 1994. A retired customs official who had worked the main ports for 3 decades. A federal judge who had dismissed cases related to the Ashford family without explanation. One by one, the conspirators were identified, located, and brought to justice. The investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, and it was even worse than anyone had imagined. The smuggling operation had begun in the early 1970s, when Edmund Ashford first made contact with networks that had been moving Nazi loot since the end of World War II. For 14 years, the Northern Star had served as a transfer point, receiving cargo from ships that couldn't enter American ports legally, storing it until arrangements could be made for distribution. The treasure in the cargo hold was just the final shipment, the one that had never been moved because Captain Cole had discovered the truth and threatened to expose everything. They had killed him for it, murdered him, and dumped his body somewhere it would never be found. Then they sealed the cargo hold, decommissioned the ferry, and let time do the rest. They assumed no one would ever look. They assumed the secret would stay buried forever. They were wrong. As the weeks passed and the investigation deepened, something remarkable began to happen in Harborview. The town that had been dying for 2 decades started coming back to life. It began with the journalists and researchers who descended on the small community, filling every available room, eating at every restaurant, shopping at every store. The bed and breakfast reopened for the first time in 5 years. The diner extended its hours to accommodate the crowds. The hardware store sold out of Harborview postcards that Martha Wellington had hastily ordered from a printer in Portland. But it wasn't just the temporary influx of visitors. It was something deeper, something more lasting. The Northern Star became a symbol. Not just of the treasure it contained, but of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to give up. School groups came from across New England to learn about World War II, about the Holocaust, about the importance of truth and justice. Veterans came to pay their respects to Captain Cole, whose courage had cost him his life. Families came to see the ferry that had sparked a national conversation about hidden history and unresolved crimes. And then the survivors started arriving. The first was a man named David Rosenberg, 87 years old, who had traveled from Israel to see the cargo hold for himself. His grandfather had been a jeweler in Vienna before the Nazis came. The family's entire inventory had been confiscated, their shop destroyed, their lives shattered. David had spent decades trying to trace what had happened to his grandfather's work, searching databases and archives, following leads that always went cold. Now, standing in the cargo hold of the Northern Star, he wept openly as he held a silver menorah that bore his grandfather's maker's mark. "I never thought I would see this again," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought it was lost forever, like so much else." More families came. From France and Germany, from Poland and Hungary, from every corner of the world where the Nazi war machine had stolen and destroyed. They came to identify pieces that had belonged to their ancestors, to reclaim fragments of lives that had been taken. Art historians worked around the clock, matching items to databases of looted works, tracing provenance, documenting everything. The treasures in the cargo hold were authenticated and catalogued. There were paintings by Vermeer and Rembrandt, thought lost for decades. Jewelry that had belonged to families murdered in the Holocaust, each piece carrying the weight of unimaginable grief. Religious artifacts from synagogues and churches across Europe, stolen by soldiers who knew only destruction. And gold, bar after bar of it, stamped with the insignia of a regime that had tried to wipe entire peoples from the face of the earth. The total value, when everything was finally assessed, exceeded $240 million. But the historical significance, the emotional weight of what had been recovered, was beyond any price. The question of what to do with the treasure became a matter of international discussion. Lawyers and diplomats debated ownership and restitution. Governments made claims and counterclaims. Insurance companies that had paid out settlements decades ago now wanted their money back. It was complicated, contentious, the kind of legal morass that could tie things up for years. But Harold and Dorothy had already made their decision. They were offered a finder's fee, 10% of the total value, standard for discoveries of this magnitude, $24 million. More money than either of them could spend in 10 lifetimes. Enough to buy mansions and yachts and everything they had ever dreamed of. They refused. "That treasure doesn't belong to us," Dorothy told the lawyers who had come to discuss the matter. "It never did. It belongs to the families who lost it. It belongs to history. We didn't do this for money." "What did you do it for?" one of the lawyers asked, genuinely curious. Dorothy looked at Harold, and he saw the same certainty in her eyes that had carried them through every challenge of their 48 years together. "We did it because it was right," she said simply. Instead of the finder's fee, they made a request. 3 requests, actually. First, that the bulk of the recovered assets go toward restitution for the victims' families, with a portion set aside for Holocaust education and memorial programs. Second, that a fund be established for the restoration of Harborview to help rebuild the town that had stood by them when they needed it most. And third, that the Northern Star itself be preserved as a museum, a floating memorial to the truth and a reminder that some secrets are too important to stay buried. The lawyers agreed, the governments agreed, everyone agreed. And so the transformation of Harborview began in earnest. The restoration of the Northern Star took nearly a year. Harold was there every day, despite his 73 years and his still healing lungs, working alongside volunteers and professionals to bring the ferry back to life. He built display cases with his own hands, crafting them from local wood with the same care he had once put into welding ship hulls. Each case was designed to hold a piece of the recovered treasure, accompanied by the story of the family it had belonged to, the life it had been part of before the darkness came. Dorothy organized the archives. 40 years as a librarian had prepared her for exactly this moment. Cataloguing documents, creating research guides, building a collection that would help scholars and students understand what had happened and why it mattered. She worked with historians from around the world, with survivors and their descendants, with anyone who had information to share or questions to ask. The upper decks of the ferry were restored to their original glory, repainted in the white and blue that had once made the Northern Star a beautiful sight on the harbour. The passenger cabin became a gallery space, displaying rotating exhibitions about World War II, the Holocaust, and the decades-long conspiracy that had hidden the truth. The captain's quarters were preserved as they had been found, a time capsule of the moment when everything had changed. And the cargo hold itself became the heart of the museum. Visitors descended the same stairs that Harold and Dorothy had walked on that first morning, entering the space where the treasure had been hidden for 37 years. The gold bars remained in their original crates, behind glass now, preserved as evidence of what had been stolen and what had been recovered. The paintings hung on temperature-controlled walls, each one labelled with the name of its original owner, the story of how it had been taken, and the family that had finally reclaimed it. The grand opening was held on a perfect summer day, 1 year after Harold and Dorothy had first discovered the cargo hold. Over 2,000 people attended, from Harbourview and Portland and Boston and beyond. Dignitaries came, ambassadors and senators, and the governor of Maine. Journalists came, the same reporters who had broken the story and followed it through every twist and turn. Survivors came, the men and women who had lost so much and finally found a piece of it again. But the most important moment came near the end of the ceremony, when an elderly woman made her way through the crowd to where Harold and Dorothy stood. She was small and frail, her white hair thin, her hands trembling slightly as she walked. But her eyes were bright, fierce with an intensity that seemed to burn from within. She was 91 years old, a survivor of Auschwitz, one of the few remaining witnesses to the worst of human evil. Her name was Ruth Feldman. "You are the ones who found my grandmother's necklace," she said, her voice accented with decades of history. Dorothy's breath caught. She remembered the locket, the one she had found in that first crate, with the tiny photograph of a young couple inside. She had wondered about them, about who they had been, about what had happened to them. "Your grandmother," Dorothy whispered. Ruth nodded slowly. Her name was Miriam. She was 17 when that photograph was taken. She gave the locket to my mother before they were separated at the camp. My mother survived. My grandmother did not. She paused, her eyes glistening. My mother searched for that locket her entire life. She died believing it was lost forever. Ruth reached into her purse and withdrew the locket, now cleaned and polished, the photograph inside restored. She opened it and showed them the faces of a young couple, frozen in a moment of happiness that the world had tried to destroy. "But it wasn't lost," Ruth said. "Because of you, it was found. Because of you, I can hold my grandmother's memory in my hands." She stepped forward and embraced Dorothy, holding her tight, two women from different worlds connected by an act of courage and compassion. "You gave me back my grandmother," Ruth whispered. "How can I ever thank you?" Dorothy couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face as she held the elderly survivor, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had found. "You just did," she finally managed. "You just did." The months that followed were unlike anything Harbourview had ever experienced. Tourists came by the thousands, drawn by the story that had captured the world's attention. They filled the hotels and bed and breakfasts, ate at the restaurants, shopped at the stores. Businesses that had been closed for years reopened. New businesses started. Young people who had left for opportunities elsewhere began coming back, seeing for the first time that their hometown might have a future after all. The restoration fund that Harold and Dorothy had requested poured money into the community. Main Street was repaved and rebuilt, the storefronts renovated, the old movie theater restored to its former glory. The elementary school reopened, filled with children whose families had returned to a town that believed in itself again. The fishing industry, dormant for so long, began to revive as new markets opened and old boats were repaired. And at the center of it all, the Northern Star sat at the municipal dock, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. She was beautiful now. her hull gleaming white against the blue water, her decks filled with visitors who came to learn and remember and hope. Harold and Dorothy became local legends, but they never acted like it. They still lived in their small Cape Cod house, still took their morning walks along the harbour, still shared coffee at the kitchen table where they had made the decision that changed everything. Fame meant nothing to them. Wealth meant nothing. What mattered was the work they had done and the lives they had touched. On the morning of their 49th wedding anniversary, Harold woke before dawn. He dressed quietly, trying not to wake Dorothy, and slipped out of the house. The air was cool, carrying the salt smell of the ocean, the first hints of autumn colouring the leaves on the trees. He walked down to the harbour, past the shops that were just beginning to open, past the fishermen preparing their boats, until he reached the dock where the Northern Star waited. He stood for a long moment, looking at the ferry that had brought them so much joy and so much pain. She had almost killed him that night of the fire. She had brought dangers he had never imagined, threats he had never expected. But she had also given him something he had spent 49 years trying to provide, a dream fulfilled, a promise kept. He climbed aboard and made his way to the upper deck, to the spot where he and Dorothy had stood so many times, watching the sun set over the water. He set up a small table, covered it with a white cloth, placed flowers in a vase, and waited. Dorothy found him there an hour later, guided by a note he had left on her pillow. She was dressed in the blue dress she had worn on their first date, the one she had kept all these years, let out a bit here and there as life demanded, but still recognizably the same. "Harold McAllister," she said, climbing the stairs to the upper deck. "What on earth are you doing?" He stood and took her hand, leading her to the table where breakfast waited. Orange juice and pastries, fruit and coffee, simple things made special by the setting. "I made you a promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 49 years ago, on a beach not far from here, I told you I would give you a boat, a place to live on the water, a dream." Dorothy smiled, her eyes glistening. "I never held it against you." "I know, that's what made it worse." He gestured around them, at the deck, at the harbour, at the ferry that had become so much more than either of them had imagined. "It took me 49 years, but I finally delivered." Dorothy laughed, the same laugh that had captured his heart in a dusty library all those decades ago. "Harold, this is a museum. We can't live here." "I know, but we can visit whenever we want. We can stand here just like this and watch the sun set. We can feel the water beneath us, hear the waves against the hull. It's not exactly what I promised, but—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Dorothy stepped forward and kissed him, soft and warm, the kiss of a love that had survived 49 years of challenges and changes and never once wavered. "It's better," she whispered. "It's so much better, because this boat, this ferry, she doesn't just belong to us. She belongs to everyone who visits, everyone who learns, everyone who remembers." She pulled back and looked into his eyes. "You didn't just give me a boat, Harold. You gave me a legacy." They stood together on the upper deck as the sun climbed higher, painting the harbour in shades of gold and rose. The Northern Star rocked gently beneath them, settling into the tide. In the distance, they could hear the town waking up, the sounds of a community that had found its way back from the brink. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked softly. "The money we could have had, the easy life?" Harold considered the question carefully. He thought about the finder's fee, the $24 million they had turned down. He thought about what they could have done with that money, the comfort it would have bought, the security. But then he thought about Ruth Feldman holding her grandmother's locket, about David Rosenberg weeping over a silver menorah, about the children who visited the museum every week, learning about history, about courage, about the importance of doing what's right, even when it's hard. "Not for 1 second," he said. They stayed on the deck until noon, talking and laughing and remembering. They talked about their children, grown now with families of their own, who had called yesterday to wish them a happy anniversary. They talked about the grandchildren they hoped would visit soon to see the ferry, to learn the story. They talked about Captain Cole, whose sacrifice had finally been honored, whose name was now inscribed on a memorial plaque in the cargo hold. They talked about the future, about the museum, about the town, about all the good that had come from one decision to do the right thing. And they talked about each other, about the journey they had shared, the life they had built, the love that had sustained them through everything. "You know," Dorothy said as the afternoon sun warmed the deck, "when I took that job at the Harborview Library 49 years ago, I never imagined this." "Imagined what?" "Any of it. Falling in love with a shipyard welder who could barely string 2 sentences together when he was nervous. Building a life in a town that wasn't mine. Raising children who turned out better than we deserved. And then, in our 70s, stumbling into the adventure of a lifetime." She shook her head, wonder in her eyes. "If you had told me, that first day when you came into the library pretending to look for a book on diesel engines just so you could talk to me, that we would end up here, I would have thought you were crazy." Harold grinned. "You knew I was faking?" "Of course I knew. You had grease on your hands and didn't even try to hide it. Worst library patron I ever saw." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the water. Nearby, a family with young children was boarding the ferry for a tour. The kids were pointing and chattering excitedly. Their parents looked tired but happy. The docent, one of the local volunteers who now gave tours daily, was welcoming them aboard. "We did something good," Harold said quietly, "something that mattered." "We did," Dorothy agreed. "But you know what matters most to me?" "What?" She took his hand, the same hand that had held hers across 49 years of marriage, through joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. "That we did it together." The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon now, the sky shifting from blue to gold to the soft pink of early evening. The ferry tours had ended for the day. The visitors had gone home. The dock was quiet, the water calm. Harold and Dorothy remained on the upper deck, watching the light change, feeling the gentle sway of the ship beneath them. In a few hours, they would walk home, hand in hand, to the small house they had shared for so many years. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, new opportunities to tell the story. The work was never really done. But for now, in this moment, there was only the two of them and the boat and the sea. "Happy anniversary, Dottie," Harold said softly. "Happy anniversary, Harold." The sun touched the water, spreading light across the harbour like spilled gold. The northern star rocked gently, her hull creaking, her deck warm beneath their feet. She was home now. They all were. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Harold McAllister realized something he had known all along, but had never quite been able to put into words. The treasure they had found in the cargo hold, the gold and paintings and artifacts worth $240 million, it was valuable beyond measure. But it wasn't the greatest treasure they had discovered. The greatest treasure was this, right here. The woman beside him, the life they had built, the courage they had found, the difference they had made. That was worth more than all the gold in the world. 6 months later, on a cold February morning, the final verdict came down in the trial of Victor Ashford. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and, in a historic ruling that made headlines around the world, accessory after the fact to the murder of Captain Raymond Cole. He was sentenced to 47 years in federal prison. At 63 years old, he would die behind bars. Sheriff Patterson received 22 years, the former senator 18, the customs official 15. The judge, who had cooperated with investigators in exchange for leniency, received 8 years plus disbarment. The conspiracy that had protected Nazi treasure for almost 5 decades was finally and completely dismantled. On the day of the sentencing, Harold and Dorothy watched the news from their living room. They didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching men, even guilty men, led away in chains. But there was satisfaction. There was closure. Justice had been served. The following spring brought something unexpected, a letter from the President of the United States. Harold and Dorothy read it together, sitting at the kitchen table where they had made so many important decisions. The letter praised their courage, their integrity, their commitment to truth. It described them as an example for all Americans, a reminder of what ordinary citizens could accomplish when they chose to do what was right, and it invited them to the White House for a ceremony honoring their contributions to the recovery of stolen cultural heritage. "The White House," Dorothy breathed. "Harold, we're going to the White House." "Seems like it. I don't have anything to wear." Harold laughed, pulling her close. "We'll figure it out. We always do." The ceremony was held in the Rose Garden on a perfect May afternoon. Harold wore a suit borrowed from their son, slightly too large but presentable. Dorothy wore a blue dress she had found at a thrift store in Portland, elegant and simple, perfect for the occasion. They stood beside the president, cameras flashing, as medals were placed around their necks. The Presidential Citizens Medal, the second highest civilian honor in the country, awarded for exemplary deeds performed in service of the nation. "These two individuals," the president said, addressing the assembled crowd, "remind us that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're retirees living on fixed incomes in small towns, buying abandoned ferries for pocket change because they believe in the power of dreams." Laughter rippled through the audience. Harold and Dorothy McAllister could have taken the easy path. They could have accepted the money, walked away, and lived comfortably for the rest of their lives. Instead, they chose the hard path, the right path. They chose to fight for truth, for justice, for the memory of those who had suffered and those who had been silenced. The president turned to face them directly. "Because of your courage, stolen treasures have been returned to their rightful owners. Families have found closure after decades of uncertainty. A criminal conspiracy that spanned generations has been exposed and dismantled, and a small town in Maine has been reborn." He smiled warmly. "You have shown us what is possible when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you." The applause was thunderous. Harold and Dorothy stood together, overwhelmed and humbled as the crowd rose to its feet. Later, at the reception, they found themselves surrounded by dignitaries and celebrities, all eager to shake their hands and hear their story. It was surreal, standing in the White House, being treated like heroes, when just 2 years ago they had been anonymous retirees worrying about how to pay the rent. "How do you feel?" a reporter asked, microphone extended. Dorothy looked at Harold. He looked back at her, and in that single glance, they said everything that needed to be said. "Grateful," Dorothy answered. "We feel grateful." They returned to Harborview the next day. The town threw a parade, a modest affair by most standards, but the largest the community had seen in 50 years. Fire trucks led the procession, followed by the high school marching band, followed by a convertible carrying Harold and Dorothy, waving to crowds that lined Main Street 3 deep. Everyone came out. Martha from the hardware store, Gus Henriksen, leaning on a cane but grinning like a schoolboy, Agnes the postmaster, the fishermen who had guarded the ferry, the volunteers who had helped restore it, children who had learned about World War II in the museum, families who had moved back to a town that believed in itself again. They all came to celebrate the couple who had reminded them what was possible. That evening, after the parade, after the speeches, after the cake and punch at the town hall, Harold and Dorothy walked down to the harbor one more time. The sun was setting, painting the water in colors that seemed to come from another world. The Northern Star waited at the dock, her lights glowing softly in the gathering dusk. They boarded quietly, climbing to the upper deck where they had spent so many hours, so many evenings, so many moments of joy and fear and hope. "It's been quite a journey," Dorothy said softly. "It has. Are you glad we bought that ferry?" Harold thought about the question. He thought about the fear and the danger, the sleepless nights and the threats. He thought about the fire that had nearly killed him. He thought about the weight of responsibility they had carried for months. But he also thought about Ruth Feldman holding her grandmother's locket, about the children who visited the museum every week, about the town that had come back to life, about the justice that had finally been served for Captain Cole and all the victims whose treasures had been stolen. "Every single day," he said. Dorothy leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. The stars were coming out now, one by one, scattered across the velvet sky. The water lapped gently against the hull. The ferry rocked, slow and peaceful, like a cradle. "We did something that mattered," she said. "We made a difference." "We did. And we did it together." Harold smiled, pulling her closer. 49 years of marriage, of building a life side by side, of facing every challenge as a team. This was just one more chapter in a story that still wasn't finished. "Always together," he said. "That's the only way I know." The moon rose over the harbour, casting silver light across the water. In the distance, the lights of Harbourview twinkled like earthbound stars. The town was quiet now, settling into sleep, dreaming of better days that had finally arrived. And on the deck of the Northern Star, two elderly people who had bought an abandoned ferry for $850 sat together in the moonlight, holding hands, watching the world they had helped to change. Some people spend their whole lives searching for treasure, Harold thought. But the real treasure was never the gold or the paintings or the artifacts. It was this. It was love. It was courage. It was the choice to do what was right, even when it was hard. It was the belief that one person or two people could make a difference. That was the treasure that mattered. That was the legacy they would leave behind. And it was worth more than $240 million would ever be. Anyone can uncover the truth if they're brave enough to look and honest enough to act on what they find. As the morning light warmed the restored deck of the Northern Star, Harold and Dorothy McAllister stood together where it all began, not as accidental treasure hunters, but as guardians of justice. The couple who had been laughed at for buying junk had reminded the world that integrity has no price tag. Because for Harold and Dorothy, and for everyone who now visits the museum they built, the real discovery was never about the gold. It was about proving that ordinary people with extraordinary hearts can change everything. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of courage and hidden treasures. Click to sail with us and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some secrets are meant to be found.